Forget modern survival shows. Real survival happened centuries ago, when peasants faced brutal winters, failed harvests, and no backup plans. No supermarkets, no food banks, no second chances. Yet somehow they made it through. How? By mastering clever, resourceful techniques that most of us have completely forgotten. These weren't just life hacks, they were lifelines. Today we're diving into 8 genius medieval tricks that helped peasants stay fed all year, even when the world around them was cold, cruel, and starving. Number 1. Bark bread. In the spring of 1315, Europe was entering the first year of what would become one of the worst periods of starvation in its history, the Great Famine. Crops had failed due to relentless rains and cold weather. The grain stores were empty, livestock either dead or slaughtered long ago, and entire communities stood on the edge of collapse. In this desperate context, medieval families turned to a survival method so extreme by modern standards, it almost sounds fictional. They began eating tree bark. But this wasn't some improvised measure. They knew exactly what they were doing. Bark bread was a product of generations of knowledge, passed down orally and by hard-won experience. What they were after wasn't the rough outer bark you see on the surface of trees, but the soft, moist inner layer called the cambium. It's the cream-colored part that lies between the hardwood and the outer bark. It contains enough nutrients, carbohydrates, and even some vitamins to keep the human body functioning. Just barely, but functioning. The people of the time understood that not all trees were suitable. Birch and pine were the most commonly used because their inner bark was not only more palatable, but less toxic. Trees like oak required special processing to remove harmful substances before they could be safely consumed. The process of gathering bark was labor-intensive, precise, and often a family affair. Peasants would venture into the forest in early spring when the sap was flowing, and the bark was easier to separate from the tree. With sharpened knives or even bone tools, they scored vertical lines into the bark about 6 inches apart. The golden rule was to never cut all the way around the trunk. Doing so would kill the tree, and in a world where sustainable harvesting was not a theory but a necessity for survival, that would mean forfeiting next year's food source. Once the bark was removed, it had to be dried. People spread it over hot stones near a fire, turning it repeatedly to avoid scorching. After it was fully dried and brittle, it was ground, usually by hand, into a rough, coarse flour. This step alone could take hours and often fell to the older members of the family or children, not strong enough for heavy field labor. The flour produced was bitter, resinous, and extremely fibrous, but it could be mixed with a small amount of actual grain flour, usually at a 1-to-3 ratio, to stretch precious food supplies. The result was a dense, chewy bread that filled the stomach and kept people alive, even if it didn't satisfy the palate. Medieval chroniclers, especially monks, sometimes recorded variations in bark types, noting how birch produced a slightly sweeter flour while pine gave a sharper, more resinous taste. They even experimented with leaching techniques similar to those used for acorns to remove some of the bitterness and make the food more tolerable. Bark bread was not considered real food by anyone who had a choice. It was a measure of last resort, a grim reminder of how thin the line between survival and starvation could be. And yet, this technique helped entire communities survive prolonged periods of famine. It represents the ingenuity, endurance, and brutal realism of medieval life. Number 2, plant rope. In the medieval world, rope wasn't something you bought, it was something you made, often with materials that most modern people would walk right past without a second thought. Plant-based rope was one of the most essential tools in a peasant's daily life, and the ability to craft it from scratch could mean the difference between a working farm and disaster. Rope was used constantly for hauling, securing, binding, building, repairing, and sometimes even for life-saving improvisations during conflict or emergencies. It wasn't a luxury, it was a core technology, and creating it required a deep understanding of the natural materials available in the surrounding environment. One of the most common sources was the stinging nettle. Though uncomfortable to handle without preparation, Nettle stems, once harvested at the right time, late summer when their fibers were at their peak strength, offered incredibly durable fibers. After harvesting, the stems would be soaked in water, a process called retting, which allowed bacteria to break down the softer plant tissues, leaving behind the tough, sinewy fibers inside. This step could take several weeks, and it had to be carefully monitored to avoid rot. Once retted, the stems were dried and the remaining fibers separated by hand or with simple tools. What emerged were flexible but strong strands ready to be twisted into cord. Willow bark provided another highly valued material. In early spring, when the sap was running and the bark could be peeled away cleanly from young branches, entire strips of inner bark were harvested. These long, pliable strips could be twisted while still green. As they dried, they hardened and tightened, actually increasing their strength over time. Unlike many synthetic ropes today, which degrade in harsh weather or over years of use, properly prepared plant rope could endure heavy strain, moisture, and temperature changes with remarkable resilience. Even human hair found its use during times of siege or resource shortages. In accounts from castle defenses, women and children contributed by braiding their hair into ropes capable of lifting heavy supply baskets or lowering messengers from high towers. Braiding involved adding strands gradually to maintain even thickness and strength, a technique requiring coordination and patience, especially when working under duress. The actual construction of rope followed a precise logic. Individual fibers were twisted tightly in one direction, and then those bundles were twisted together in the opposite direction. This counter-twisting created a structure that locked itself tighter under tension. This principle, still used in modern rope manufacturing, made hand-spun medieval rope far more robust than one might expect. Children learned from a young age how to roll fibers against their thighs to produce consistent, even tension, and each type of fiber had its own specific method and rhythm. Mastering the skill was not just practical. It gave peasants the tools to maintain their homes, secure their animals, build shelter, and create trade goods. Rope making was both a daily necessity and a symbol of knowledge passed from one generation to the next, proving that real strength often comes not from tools, but from technique. Number 3. Wild food. In the medieval world, knowledge of wild food wasn't a luxury or a niche skill reserved for a few. It was a widespread, essential part of survival for the vast majority of the rural population. The forest, to a medieval peasant, wasn't just a backdrop to daily life. It was a dynamic, living pantry. Entire families were raised with an intimate understanding of what could be eaten, when it should be harvested, how it had to be prepared, and just as crucially, what would kill you if handled incorrectly. Fishing, for example, didn't require elaborate gear. Peasants created fish traps from willow branches, weaving structures designed to exploit natural water flow and fish behavior. These traps worked passively, often catching enough to feed multiple families overnight. Without access to metal, they carved hooks from bone or used thorns, heating bones carefully until they were pliable, then shaping them and letting them harden in the correct form. These techniques weren't improvised. They were tested, passed down, and refined over generations. Their plant knowledge was equally comprehensive. Wild greens like sorrel and nettle were among the first sources of nutrition in early spring, rich in vitamins that prevented conditions like scurvy. Berries, tubers, and edible flowers were gathered with attention to ripeness and timing. Even dangerous plants had a place. Certain roots and seeds, though toxic raw, were rendered safe through boiling, roasting, or fermentation. Acorns, which are bitter and tannic, were turned into flour only after soaking and rinsing the groundnuts multiple times, a process so routine that some families had dedicated vessels for leaching them. Preservation was another area of skill. In the absence of salt or refrigeration, meat was thin-sliced, then dried using wind exposure or slow smoke from particular woods that had antimicrobial properties. This created a kind of jerky that could last weeks, even months. They knew how to protect it from insects and spoilage using natural wraps like leaves or storing it in bark containers. Even insects were not ignored. They identified high-protein species like beetle larvae or grasshoppers, which could be roasted or ground and added to food. None of this was random. It was systematic survival based on deep observation of the environment and relentless adaptation. When cultivated fields failed due to drought, war, or blight, wild food didn't. That is why, in many cases, entire medieval villages outlasted crises. Not because they stockpiled, but because they never stopped knowing how to feed themselves directly from the land. Number 4. Natural tools. In the medieval world, the absence of metal tools didn't mean helplessness. For peasants and craftspeople, the forest, riverbank, and open plains served as fully stocked workshops. With a blend of inherited skill and hands-on experience, they could transform the most basic raw materials, stone,